All right. So going into module 14, this is a module talking about populations, species distribution, so on and so forth. So these are some of the topics that Dr. Ortiz told me to go over specifically. And so I'm just going to go through them one by one as we go along. So first off, knowing the difference between population size and population density. So population size is referring to the total number of individuals in a population, while population density is referring to the number of individuals per unit area. So in this example I have below, there's a field that I drew, which is this green blob, and each dot in that field represents an organism. So if we were to find the population size of this whole population, we would just count out each individual organism. So in this case, the population size would be 15. Whereas with the population density, now you'd have to specify the area that you're looking at and looking at that population within that certain area. So here I have like A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the side. And let's say that I made a grid with these. So now let's say that I picked a random area within this whole field. And let's say that I picked, we'll do B2. So this box right here. So if we're looking at the population density of this area, there would be 2 organisms. So that is the difference between population size and population density. Going forward, briefly, we talk about species distribution patterns. So this is the distribution of individuals within a habitat at a particular point in time. So there's 3 types of distribution patterns that are gone over in the textbook. The first one being random distribution. So with random distribution, let's say your population, it's just kind of randomly dispersed throughout a specific area. So a good example of this is with flowers or plants. Usually they just disperse randomly. You won't usually see them in a specific order unless, of course, they were like planted by someone. But usually in nature and the wild, you would find flowers just randomly distributed throughout, let's say, a field. And then there's also a clumped distribution pattern. So this is the most common one. And usually animals, they like to herd together for more safety. And so in the example that I have drawn here, there's some starfish and barnacles on a rock. So their populations would be clumped together. So in a clumped population, you would usually see organisms all clumped together. And then lastly, with a uniform distribution pattern, a good example of this is with penguins. Usually when you see penguins, they're kind of in this really uniform, like they're usually in lines, they're usually spread out really evenly. So in a uniform distribution pattern, everything would be spread out in that way. Right. So those are the different types of distribution patterns that you would see species undergo. And next, talking a little bit about survivorship curves. So this is just to show the distribution of individuals in a population according to age. So there's 3 types of survivorships. There's type 1, which humans usually fall under, and this means that there's a low death rate and many live to an old age. So organisms that fall under a type 1 survivorship, a lot of them don't usually die when they're young. They usually can survive and live until they're very old. Whereas with a type 2 survivorship, this is when you have a moderate death rate. There's an equal chance of death at all ages. I think the example that was given in the textbook was with a bird. And so at any time in their lifetime, they have an equal chance of death. Whereas in a type 3 survivorship, this is including usually trees or plants. They have a high death rate at a young age. So usually when trees are just sprouting, they're usually prone to being eaten or it's too cold. So at a younger age in that tree's life cycle, the younger it is, the more chance it has of dying, unfortunately. But if it gets to live to an old age, the chances of it dying at an older age are a lot lower. So those are the 3 types of survivorships. And then briefly, we talk about exponential and logistic growth patterns in populations. So with exponential growth, this is an early pattern of accelerating population size. So a good example of thinking of exponential growth of a population is with bacteria. So with bacteria, as we've gone over in previous modules, they can multiply through like binary fission, and the process is really quickly. So their populations are growing and growing and growing and dividing at an exponential rate. So over time, their population size is increasing. And usually when we grow them in a lab, we give them all of the nutrients that they need to grow at this exponential rate. So in the case of exponential growth, this would occur with an infinite amount of natural resources. So the bacteria in this case, they have an infinite amount of food and nutrients that they could grow with. Whereas with logistic growth, this measure is a lot more like reality. This is modeling how population growth occurs with limited resources in the environment. So in the case of competition, or let's say an animal has to have a certain food resource and that resource is limited, there will be a capacity for that population. So yes, the population size will grow, but eventually at one point, there won't be enough resources for it to keep growing. There's a cap. And then moving forward, talking about density dependent factors and density independent factors. So density dependent factors, this is when the density of the population is affected by growth rate and mortality. So good examples of this are with predation, competition, and parasites, whereas density independent factors cause mortality regardless of population density. So this can occur with more physical phenomenons in nature, such as weather or natural disasters or pollution. So basically, with density dependent factors, this is depending on your population. So let's say that there's a herd of lions and a herd of zebras, right? So if there is a lot of zebras in their population, this herd of lions is going to have a lot more food to eat. So thus they can provide for more young. So their population size will grow based on the population size of the zebra. So this is one reason why predation is a density dependent factor. Whereas with a, density independent factor, with weather or natural disasters, it doesn't really choose who dies based on the population size. It's just really random. So in the case of, let's say there's a flood, it could affect all of the zebras, it could affect all of the lions. It's kind of an equal chance, and it doesn't really depend on their population size or density in that case. And then briefly talk about competitive exclusion. So this is talking about how different species cannot coexist in a community if they're competing for all the same resources. So the example that I have below shows 2 different bacterias. So we have bacteria 1 and bacteria 2. And if they're grown in separate test tubes, they can grow fine. And we know that these two bacteria, they compete for the same exact resources. They eat the same exact food, and they do pretty much the same exact function. So when you mix them both in the test tube, now there's competition. So eventually one bacteria is going to outlive the other because it's going to fight for the same exact resources. So in this case, the blue bacteria, it competed and it actually survived. In the case that there's like food in the test tube, it took all of that food, while the red bacteria's population size decreased because it wasn't able to access that food due to that blue bacteria taking it all. So in nature, if you have in an environment two species that are competing for the same exact thing, it just will not work out. Like there needs to be a different thing that they have to compete for. And then going on to symbiotic relationships. So symbiotic relationships is referring to close long-term interactions between different species. So there are three different types that are gone over. There's commensal, mutualistic, and parasitic. So the one that you usually think of when you think of a symbiotic relationship is mutualistic, which is depicted here in the middle with a sea anemone and clownfish. So in the case of a mutualistic relationship, both of these organisms are benefiting. So both benefit. So in this case, the clownfish, it goes into the sea anemone and it hides in there for protection from predators, whereas the sea anemone, it's benefiting from the clownfish because the clownfish is giving it the nutrients that it needs to survive. So that is a mutualistic relationship because both are benefiting. Whereas in a commensal relationship, there is one organism benefiting and the other organism is unaffected. So one benefits, other unaffected. So in this case, I have a monarch butterfly on a milkweed plant. So actually in the larval stage, so when they're caterpillars, the monarch butterfly usually eats the milkweed plant, and the milkweed plant has a certain toxin that birds do not like. So the caterpillars, they're eating the leaves, they're getting these toxins in their body, and so they're benefiting because the birds will not want to eat them, but it's not really doing anything to the plant. The plant really isn't getting any benefit out of this. This diagram could be a bit confusing, however, because if you think about a butterfly, the butterfly is pollinating that plant and as well getting something out of it. That would be a mutualistic relationship. But in the case of the caterpillar gaining those toxins, that would be a commensal because it's getting a benefit and the plant is not being affected at all. And then lastly, parasitic relationships. This is when you have one organism benefits and the other does not. So in the case of mosquitoes, they are, they don't really benefit us at all. They actually can give us viruses. They can give us all kinds of diseases. So that's not a benefit to us. That's actually harmful to us. Whereas the mosquitoes, they're getting blood from us. So I guess in that case, they're getting a benefit from us. So those are the three different types of symbiotic relationships. And then briefly talk about species richness and relative abundance. So I'm just going to go over the definitions. So species richness, it describes the number of species living in a habitat, whereas relative abundance is talking about the number of individuals in a species relative to the total number of individuals in all species within a system. So with species richness, you're basically looking at all of the species in a habitat, whereas with relative abundance, you're looking at the individuals of a species and comparing that to all of the species within a system. So that pretty much sums up Module 14. Are there any questions before we move on to Module 15? All right, so I'm just going to continue on to Module 15, and shouldn't be super long, and then we can take a little break afterward. So in Module 15, this is the module you're currently working on, talking about ecosystems, comparing and contrasting different types of biomes, food webs and food chains, and the biogeochemical cycles. So an ecosystem is a community of living organisms and their environment. And so 3 of the main ecosystems that we go over are freshwater ecosystems, marine ecosystems, and terrestrial ecosystems. So freshwater ecosystems are the least common, marine are the most common, and terrestrial ecosystems are usually divided and grouped into biomes. Oh, and I just got a question in the chat. So for the relationships between other species, the butterfly is a mutualistic relationship with the flower. Yes, so the butterfly itself is having a mutualistic relationship with the flower, going back to this slide, because the flower is getting pollinated and the butterfly is getting food from it. But in the case of the caterpillar, that's a commensal relationship because the caterpillar is getting the toxins from the plant, getting the food from the plant, but the plant really isn't getting any benefit from that whatsoever. I hope that helped clarify. All right, so continuing, these are the 3 different types of ecosystems we go over in the video that's posted, and I would just know the differences between each of them, and yeah, there's a whole section of the video that goes over each of the differences. So I'll just know those. All right, and then the module also talks about how organisms acquire energy. So there's 2 different ways that we classify organisms. We usually classify them into autotrophs or heterotrophs. So autotrophs, they're organisms that make their own food. So these would include plants or bacteria. So in the case of plants, they would be referred to as photoautotrophs because they undergo photosynthesis and sunlight is their energy source. So plants are taking in sunlight and they're making their own sugars to survive. Whereas chemoautotrophs use inorganic molecules as their energy sources. So the example of this would be with bacteria. Bacteria usually use inorganic molecules and they can provide themselves with their own sugars or foods that they need to survive. So that's why they're autotrophs. Whereas heterotrophs must consume other living things. So commonly most animals, I would say, are heterotrophs, if not all. And humans are definitely heterotrophs. We must eat other organisms. We must eat other plants in order to survive. We don't produce those on our sugars or fats or molecules that we need to survive on our own. And then we talk about the food chain versus food webs. So a food chain is basically a linear sequence of nutrients passing from organism to organism. So it would be depicted in this way that you see like a mouse here, he eats this plant, and then a snake later on, he goes and eats the mouse, and then this hawk eats the snake. So this is just sequencing out the whole passing of energy in one case. Whereas a food web is more complex. It accounts for multiple species interacting together in, let's say, a whole community or ecosystem. So in this case, we still have our mouse, we still have our snake, we still have our plants down here. We still have, in this case, an eagle, not a hawk. But as you can see, there's a lot more species that are shown in this food web, and they all together contribute to how energy is passed from each level throughout the ecosystem. And then lastly, this module goes over the biogeochemical cycles. So this is recycling of organic matter between organisms and the non-living environment. So for all of these, I would recommend just going back to the video. There's a whole section in the last part that goes over the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and sulfur cycle. So I was going to go into explaining each one by one, but after going through the video again, I feel like it was really straightforward. So I definitely just check that out. And remember, this is in module 15. So if you have a question about those, I would go back to that specific part of the video. It's basically talking about how these molecules cycle through the system. All right, so that concludes module 15. Are there any questions? All right, so before we head into module 16, I'm just gonna give you guys a 5-minute break, and then we can come back in a few minutes. So it's almost 4:30, so we can come back at 4:35 and continue. All right. All right, so module 16, basically this is the one that you're going to start on for next week. This is a module on biodiversity and talking about different threats that occur to biodiversity, to species in the area, and how we can conserve our environment and our ecosystem. And yeah. So biodiversity is basically talking about the variety of living things, all forms of life. This can be as small as genes all the way to huge organisms like whales or like anything, animals, plants. So there are 3 different types of biodiversity. There's genetic diversity. So these are differences in genes or gene combinations. We have chemical diversity. This is when species can produce different assortments of chemicals in their cells. So there can be a diverse set of chemicals that are produced. There's also ecosystem diversity. So this is the number of different ecosystems in a geographical area. And biodiversity is really important. And these are just, there's so many ways that biodiversity is important, but 2 ways that are highlighted in the textbook are that a lot of plants, they can be used for, or chemicals that are made in the natural world can be used for medications. So in the case of human benefit, if we have a lot of diversity of different plants or different bacteria, basically, if we have a lot of different ways to obtain chemicals from the natural world, there's a lot of ways that we can figure out to help a lot of humans in case overcome diseases or sickness. So in that case, biodiversity is very important. And then also in the case of farming, plants and animals are used for food. So if we don't have a lot of biodiversity with plants and animals, we won't be able to survive off of foods. So it's really important that we have a lot of organisms, we have a lot of different types of species in abundance throughout the planet so that we can all have a benefit. And of course, when it comes to the animal kingdom, if you have like a certain plant that an animal eats start to go extinct and it's like cut down, in that case, that animal won't survive. And then, as before, as we referred to in our food chain, that could affect not only just one animal, but also all of the other animals going up that food chain. So it's really important for us to have a lot of biodiversity. And there are, like I mentioned before, a lot of threats to biodiversity. So in the case of habitat loss, if animals don't have a place to live anymore, they may not be able to survive. In the cases that, let's say, a farmer wanted to expand his land, but his land was in a part where it was all natural, it wasn't really touched by humans, those animals that were in that habitat before are now going to have to move somewhere else, and they may not be able to survive in a new location. So there would be a loss of biodiversity in that case. Also, over harvesting, in the case of, I believe it's palm oil, a lot of people, palm oil is used in a lot of beauty products, a lot of soaps. So we usually take a lot of palm oil so that we can make these products. But when we over harvest, we run out of that palm oil and we run out of the palms. And so it's really important that we don't over harvest these natural resources so that these organisms can still thrive on their own in the wild. Also, introducing exotic species. So sometimes people may bring species that aren't usually found in a certain area. So, for example, I forget his name, but there's a drug lord, and he brought hippos over to somewhere in South America. And because of the hippos population, hippos aren't native to that area. Basically, there's no competition for them. There's no predators for them. And they just like eat and eat and eat. And they just have been taking over this whole area. So they have been like in the streets and rampaging, and people are like, we need to get rid of these hippos. But because there hasn't been any threat to them in that habitat, all of these other animals are being affected. And so that's affecting the biodiversity in that area. And also climate change. So as the climate gets warmer or colder in an area, certain animals would not be able to thrive, or even plants cannot thrive. And so their populations will decrease, and that will cause a decrease in biodiversity. So these are just a few threats that can occur to biodiversity and that we need to watch out for. And then briefly, the chapter talks about species area relationships. So this is the rate at which new species are seen when the area surveyed is increased. So as we inspect a certain area, so in this case, a forest area, as we inspect more and more of it, we're going to find a certain number of species. So this can be charted out and actually can be used to calculate the extinction rate of a population of a certain species. And then talk about ways to conserve. So like we mentioned before, there are a lot of threats to biodiversity, but there are a lot of actions that we can take as humans to preserve biodiversity and help for there to be more biodiversity. So in some cases, we can set aside preserves. We can make certain areas all natural. They have to stay that way to promote the biodiversity in that area. We can reduce hunting. Sometimes animals are overhunted. So like with rhinos, they're usually overhunted. They're going extinct because of it. So if we can reduce our hunting of those populations, we can help them regrow. We can also reduce our carbon emissions and pollution. When we have more carbon emissions going into the air and we have more pollution, this is causing for that climate change. And a lot of organisms are affected by that. They may not be able to survive. We can also stop cutting down forests. Like I said before, with habitat loss, if we take down a whole area where animals naturally thrive, their biodiversity will be lowered because they can't survive in other areas. And we can also try to restore habitats. So this is actually a pretty complicated one because in some cases, some animals or plants may go extinct. So of course, you can't fully restore that habitat to how it was before, but you can try to make it like it used to be and try to promote more biodiversity that way and have more new organisms come in that case and help that area thrive once more. And then lastly, talk about biodiversity hotspots. So biodiversity hotspots, there's a few located in the world. They have at least 1,500 vascular plant species found nowhere else. So there is lots and lots of plant life. And these areas are actually threatened. So they must be protected because they have a lot of biodiversity. They can provide us and many other organisms with so many resources. And so it's really important that we preserve these habitats going forward. So that pretty much concludes everything from Module 16. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. But otherwise, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful break. And good luck with all of your finals. You got this. I'll stop recording.